can just introduce myself. Hello.
Our usual sound person isn't here, but they'll give you a low level buzz. I do hear that now. Let's see. I don't think it's on here. They might have to turn it off from the house. Hey, Jose Luis. Right here, brother. Can we get this mic off by any chance? I think it's giving a little feedback. I don't see anybody. I thought it was y'all. Okay. I don't see anybody up there. It's just giving a little bit of feedback.
No, this is the one that might. Good morning. I gotta get used to a microphone. Good morning, ahlan wa sahlan. Good morning. It is such a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with you all this morning. My name is Leyla King. I am the canon for mission and small congregations in the Diocese of West Texas. That is not why I'm here with you today. I am here with you today because I am a Palestinian American Christian clergywoman. I am an Episcopal priest, and I have been going to a number of churches, both Episcopalian and other denominations, to tell my story, my grandparents' story, and my ancestors' story, and just to share a little bit about that with all of you. So welcome. Huge thanks to Mark Chase, who disappeared, who's up there, for this invitation, and to Father Mike for inviting me here as well. I'm really, really pleased to be here with you all at All Saints, so thank you. I did have a short little video that was literally less than a minute long that I'm not going to show because we can't get the sound to work. But it was just a slideshow of some pictures of me, my grandmother, my mother, my daughter, some generations of Episcopal Palestinian women, just for you to see. And I wanted you to hear my grandmother's voice. So what happened was, after I graduated college in 2002, to date myself a little bit, I spent the summer after I graduated from college interviewing my grandmother. I had grown up around her. My grandfather had died by that time. I knew a little bit about her story, but I wanted to know the details. I wanted to get all of it. I wanted to hear her life history. And so I went out and I bought, this is really old. Do y'all remember those like mini tape recorders? Yeah? Yeah, they had like these mini tapes, and you put it in and you had to press rewind and fast forward and record. You had to hit the like play and record at the same time, right? And I bought one of those, and I went to my grandmother's house every day for about 6 or 8 weeks, and I recorded her voice and heard her stories. And everything we're going to talk about today really comes from that experience. Everything that I'm telling you today was handed down to me to a large extent from my grandmother Bahi. You can see her there. That's the day that I was ordained a deacon in the Episcopal Church in Buffalo, New York, of all places. And so this is where these stories come from. Now, hopefully all of you have a handout. Does anyone need a handout? There's Chase, there's some right here who need a handout. You'll notice that it's a bit of a pop quiz. I know many of you, maybe it's been a while since you last had to take a pop quiz, but so, here we are. And because we're in a church, I would like to remind you that if you do well on this pop quiz, if you get 100, you go straight to heaven. It's fantastic. If you don't do well, I don't know what to tell you. So we're just gonna dig right into it, right here and now. So number one. The term Semitic refers to ethnic Jews, ethnic Arabs, all of the above, or none of the above? All of the above. You're off to a great start. Well done. Ethnic Jews, the term Semitic relates to both ethnic Jews and ethnic Arabs. Let me give you the dictionary definition, just so that we have it. So the dictionary definition of Semitic is relating to or denoting a family of languages that includes Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic, and certain ancient languages such as Phoenician and Akkadian, and relating to the peoples who speak Semitic languages, especially Hebrew and Arabic. So Arabs, Palestinians, Arabs, like their Jewish cousins, are Semitic. So I'm a Semitic person, right? I was born and grew up in Houston, Texas. My mother was one of 4 children to my grandmother. My grandmother was one of 9 siblings, 8 girls and a boy. And 7 of those siblings I grew up around 7 of those siblings and their families, who all lived within about a 15, 20-minute radius of our house in Houston. And we were sort of split up into 3 different groups. We had the good Episcopalians, the right people, right? They were the good people. We had some Catholics, we liked them too. And then we had a number of Baptists, and we'll let that slide. I know Chase comes from a more evangelical background, so we'll let it slide. So the three sort of Christian, different denominations of our family would go to each of their churches on Sunday morning. And then after church, we would all gather together at one of my great aunt's houses for what we used to call coffee. And growing up, I thought everyone did this on a Sunday morning. I had no idea that this was something different from my peers, because coffee was not just like an hour with a cup of coffee. It was like an entire spread of all the things you could imagine, both Palestinian foods and American foods. You know, hard-boiled eggs, pita bread, hummus, baba ganoush, like you name it. My whatever great aunt was hosting that Sunday had slaved away most of the week to provide this feast for her family, and not just her own family, but all of those 7 siblings who lived around each other in Houston. They all had children and grandchildren, and in some cases great-grandchildren, and every single Sunday of my childhood, we all gathered together. We're talking about dozens upon dozens of people every single Sunday. All the men would sit around and watch the Spanish soccer, the Spanish-speaking soccer, and all the children would sort of hang out in one of the back bedrooms and fight with one another, and all the women would hang out in the kitchen and talk with one another, and there was this lovely mix of English and Arabic happening all the time. And then at some point in time, my great uncle Sammy, my Khalo Sammy, would sit at the head of the dining room table, and he would take one of the pieces of pita bread, the round loaves of pita bread that were always warm and always there at whoever's house we were at, and he would take it and he would break it in half, and he would hand one of the pieces to the next person beside him, and thus we would start our feast together. And it was only when I was much older and I was in the process of discernment to become an Episcopal priest that I realized every Sunday of my childhood I had 2 communions, one in church on Sunday morning and one at my great aunt's houses where my Uncle Sammy broke the bread and passed it. I like to tell another story. Why do I tell you that? Because I want us to remember that Palestinian Christians are everywhere, right? We're members of the churches, we're members of the Episcopal Church, right? We are everywhere. And we are a Semitic people, just like Jesus was. We are the inheritors, the descendants of Jesus himself, right? And I like to tell this story because some years ago, I don't know if you remember this, it actually just popped up in my Facebook memories, I think just yesterday or the day before. Some years ago, there was an AI-generated image of Jesus. Do you all remember this? Do you remember seeing this go around? And they got AI to create a picture. It was really a picture of what Jesus would have looked like. And I didn't know that was happening. All I knew was I was scrolling my Facebook feed one day, and I sort of scrolled past a picture of my cousin Joseph, and I thought, Joseph looks sort of funny in that picture. And I just kept scrolling past, and then, just a minute or two later, there was another picture of my funny picture of my cousin Joseph, and I just kept scrolling, and I didn't really pay much attention. And then there was like a third of the same picture. I was like, why is my cousin Joseph filling up my feed this morning? So I stopped at it, and I looked, and I was like, it's not even Joseph who's posting this picture. It was one of my clergy colleagues. And I was like, this is how far I got down this path. I thought, why is my clergy colleague, A, have a picture of my cousin Joseph, and B, is posting it on their page? I didn't understand. And that was when I read the little caption at the bottom that said this was an AI-generated image of what Jesus would have looked like. And I swear to God, it was my cousin Joseph. I had to stare at that picture to recognize that it really wasn't, right? Which just goes to show you that we, again, Palestinian Christians are the inheritors of Jesus on both a genetic and a faith level, right? We are the descendants of Jesus on both a genetic and in a religious sense. So that was number one. You guys are off to a good start. Let's see if we can keep going. Number two, before 1948, the land that is now called Israel and the occupied territories was governed by the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, all of the above, or none of the above. Oh, we've got a little difference here, a little bit of difference. How many of you think that, I heard the British Empire. How many of you think the British Empire? I heard all of the above. How many of you think all of the above? Oh, that was pretty even split, but the all of the aboves are right. It's a little bit of a trick question because they didn't govern Palestine at the same time, right? They governed, what's the opposite of simultaneously? Consecutively, thank you. They governed consecutively. So it started off with the Ottoman Empire, and then after World War I, it changed hands and it became a British mandate. So this is where I like to start telling some of the stories of my family. So my great-great-grandmother was named Zaleh. Now I know I've got some Arabic speakers in the audience. So you all who are Arabic speakers, what does Zaleh mean? Do you know? Yes, it means, you wouldn't name your child that. It means sorrow. Zaleh means sorrow or upset. Why was she named Zaleh? Why was she named Sorrow? Because she was a girl born to this family in a village of Shafamar that really wanted a boy. So she was born to her family in a village called Shafamar, which is about 12 miles northwest, I think, of Haifa. And she was born into a Catholic family. My great-great-grandmother Zaleh was born into a Catholic family. She was a Catholic woman. But she married into a family of Anglicans. So my great-great-grandfather's family were Anglicans, and in fact, we don't know when they converted to Anglicanism from any other denomination. We lost track of when they converted to Anglicanism. So we have been Anglicans for generations upon generations, and my great-great-grandmother Zaleh married into the Asfor family, which was an Anglican family living in Shafa Amar. Her husband, Amin, was one of 4 brothers. 3 of those brothers lived together. They were all merchants together in Shafa Amar. They had their warehouse on the bottom of the building, and then they lived in apartments on the top of the building. And they were all sort of crammed into the living spaces above the merchant shop. And this was in the time of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century. And because she lived with her husband and his brothers also, they were also married, and they married Anglican women. Now the difference between the Catholic women and the Anglican women were that the Anglican women were more often educated. So the Anglican women were literate, whereas Zaleh was illiterate. And she came from a Catholic family, whereas the rest of them were all Anglican. And so they really quite looked down on her. And they did not treat her well. In fact, they treated her quite poorly. She did have 2 children, Anisa and Anis, which means the sociable ones, and that was very common to name the girl the feminine characteristic and the boy the masculine characteristic. But soon, not long, a couple years after Anis, her second child, was born, the First World War broke out, and all of the Palestinians, especially the poor Palestinians, were drafted against their will to fight for the Ottoman Empire, and they were basically used as cannon fodder. So Amin and one of his brothers was drafted into the war, and almost immediately they were both killed. As soon as word got back to the family that Amin had been killed, the family evicted Zaleh from the homestead. They pushed her out. They told her to go back to her own family, and they kept her 2 children. So that was a very useful gasp. Thank you, that was very well done. They kept her 2 children from her. She was forced to go back to her own family with the clothes on her back, and that was all. That was all she took with her. So her name of sorrow, Zaleh, really followed her for all the rest of her life. Her children stayed with the family and grew up in Shafamar and survived, obviously, the First World War. And then the area that was called Palestine changed hands. from the Ottoman Empire to the British Empire. And you have to understand, by the time of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was in something of a shambles. So the Ottoman Empire itself was poor, was run down, and the people that it occupied, the people that it governed, were even poorer. So when Amin went to the front to be drafted with the Ottoman Empire, he left very little for his family behind. And that means that when the British came, even though the British brought with them all the evils of colonialism, which they did, they also brought wealth, education, good health care, technology that the Palestinians had never seen or never been given before. And I think it's important to note that, because while the legacy of colonialism is horrific, a number of us were just talking last night about the horrors of the legacy of colonialism, it's not an unmixed curse, right? There were some good things that the British brought with them. And that, I think, is important to remember. Okay, so yes, the British, Palestine became a British mandate after the First World War, and we're going to sort of pause there as we move on with the story. So number three, in the first half of the 20th century, the Arabs who lived in the region called Palestine practiced Islam, Christianity, Judaism, not all of the above or none of the above. All of the above. You maybe are noticing a pattern here, right? We have a good little pattern going. Yes, indeed. Both in the time of the Ottomans and in the time of the British, both in Shefa Amr, where my great-grandmother grew up, and in Haifa, where her family would eventually move and live to. There were neighborhoods. There were like little pockets. There were neighborhoods of Christians in this area, neighborhoods of Catholics in that area, neighborhoods of Muslims over here, neighborhoods of Jews over there, right? So there were some enclaves of these various faith traditions, of the people who practiced these various faith traditions, but they were all one community together. And just like here, it's not like everybody got along with each other all the time and it was paradise. No, of course not. But for the most part, they got along with one another. They understood themselves to be of the same community, right? So when there was a Jewish funeral, for example, someone in the Jewish neighborhood died, the whole community went to that funeral. The whole community mourned together with the family. The whole community practiced the Jewish traditions of mourning as they are taught in that faith, right? Everyone participated in that, even though it may not have been your personal religion. When a couple got married, the whole town went to that wedding, right? Everybody celebrated that together, no matter the faith, right? Everyone participated in that. All the women, all the matriarchs of the family, whatever their faith tradition, would all sing the blessings upon the couple and do the lulus, right? All of them together would dance the debke, the traditional Palestinian dance of joy, right? Because even though they had different faith traditions, in the end, they are all one culture. They are all Palestinian. They all share the same culture, the same traditions, the same community together, okay? Why is that important for us today? Because we have been told that the conflict that is constantly seeming to be happening in the Holy Land is a religious conflict. That is a lie. It is not a religious conflict. It is not a religious conflict. It is purely a political one. It is purely a political conflict. Because the differences in religion never mattered. They never mattered. Okay, I realize I usually have like an hour to an hour and 15 minutes for these presentations, so you'll be glad to know this is usually a 10-question quiz, and you guys got the 8-question version because we're having to rush through it a little bit. So We're going to move right along. Number 4, Zionist refers to someone who subscribes or subscribed to a political movement originating in the 19th and 20th century Britain that advocated for a homeland for European Jews in the region then known as Palestine. European Jewish militiamen who used terrorism to forcibly evict Arabs from their homes in Palestine in the years immediately before and after 1948. The belief that it is the right of Israel to maintain current and build more settlements in Palestinian territories illegally occupied by Israel. All of the above or none of the above? All y'all have, we're done, right? You got it figured out. Well done. It is all of the above. And I want to dwell on this one a little bit longer because the sort of tagline for Zionism in its original form in the 19th century. The tagline for Zionism was a land without a people for a people without a land, right? That was the tagline of Zionism. All these Jews, and this is even before the Holocaust, right? I mean, Jews in Europe were treated horribly. They were persecuted. They were oppressed, right? They were treated horribly. And there were folks who recognized the wrongness of that. And the idea was, because we don't like to just accept people in, Western European society. We like to find them their own place, right? Let's just send them out somewhere else. So the architects for Zionism came up with this line, right? A land without a people for a people without a land. What is wrong with that? There were people in there, right? My ancestors were in that land. My great-great-grandmother, Zale, Amin, Anise, Anis, they were living in that land and had for generations. For hundreds upon hundreds of years, they lived in that land. So the lie of Zionism, a land without a people for a people without a land, is just that, a lie. The biggest lie you could imagine. There were people, and there had always been people living in that land. So in 1948, all of the sort of centuries, the decades of the movement of Zionism came to a head when the British created the State of Israel in May of 1948. A little bit before that, my grandparents had grown up together in Haifa, and they sang in the choir as youths together in St. John's Episcopal Church choir. That's where they met, where their families had always known each other. And in the previous spring, in the spring of 1947, my grandfather came to my grandmother's house and asked for her hand in marriage, and he was accepted. And so they were planning their wedding throughout the latter half of 1947. They were finally married on January 3rd, 1948, at St. John's Church, at the Episcopal Church in Haifa. They took a short trip, a honeymoon, to Cairo, where they conceived my mother, so that was handy. And then they came back to Haifa, and by this time, we're just a couple of months before the creation of Israel, what Palestinians know as the Nakba, the catastrophe, the disaster. And so there had been for about, maybe a decade, there had been sort of this push to bring these European Jews to Palestine. And even though the Jews themselves, the European Jews themselves, who had suffered greatly, and especially after the Holocaust, right, they were, most of them, poor, but when they were brought by the British government, by Europeans in power, when they were brought to Palestine, their lives were subsidized, heavily, heavily subsidized by the British government, while the native indigenous Palestinian people saw none of that well. So these European Jews were sort of imported, and they were given money, status, protection, and really leeway to do whatever the hell they wanted. And so they did. And they they formed these militia groups that were at best sort of the British government turned a blind eye to, and at worst were funded and supplied by the British government. And these European Zionist Jewish militias would go into Palestinian neighborhoods, murder people, rape women, do whatever they wanted to do in order to evict, in order to force the native Palestinian people out of their homes and out of their lives so that they could take their lands, their orchards, their livelihoods, their homes in many cases. They would force them out and then just move into their homes. So this was the kind of tinderbox that was going on in the months leading up to May 1948 when Israel was created. And this was the kind of tinderbox that my grandparents came home to after their honeymoon in Cairo in that January of 1948. And they got there, they got back, and they couldn't go straight away to their newlywed apartment because the British had put in place curfews. And when I say curfews, I don't mean like you have to be home by 10 o'clock. I mean like for 4 or 5 or 6 days or maybe even a week, no one was allowed out. No one could go anywhere, no one could do anything. And you just had to stay home because the British were trying to quell some of this violence that was erupting, because not only did you have the Zionist militias, but then you had revolutionaries, resistors in the Palestinian communities who would try and fight back, right? And it would just be mayhem. So the British would instate these curfews, and my grandparents returned home from Cairo in the midst of one of these multi-day curfews, and they were put in cells. There was no one else in the quarantine, they called it, but they separated them. They put my grandmother in one cell, my grandfather in another cell. They gave them stale bread and bad-tasting water to drink, and my grandmother said she spent the entire night awake because she was so sure that someone was going to come in and rape her. They finally, the next day, my grandfather got in touch with one of his brothers who knew someone in the fire department, and they sent a fire truck to pick them up, so that a fire truck which could go, around the curfews. And they picked them up from the quarantine and took them to the family's home on Mount Carmel in Haifa. They spent a couple of nights with my grandfather's family, and then they finally moved into their apartment together in Haifa, and they spent the next few months there. But already by that time, a lot of Palestinians were already beginning to flee for their lives. And by the time of about March, my grandparents were one of the few people left in their apartment building. My grandfather would go to work, and my grandmother said she was left all alone. She had no more neighbors. They had all fled for their lives. And it was about this time that my grandparents also began to feel very, very worried. My grandmother said she would try and sleep at night, and she would often wake up to the sound of machine guns happening in her neighborhood. There were times when she would wake up to the sounds of explosions because the Zionist militias would roll barrels of explosives into the Christian and Muslim neighborhoods of Haifa and just let them explode in the middle of the night. So they couldn't take it anymore. They were so fearful. By this time, my grandmother was about 4 months pregnant with the baby that would become my mother. And so they took what they could carry. They packed a suitcase. They wore the clothes that they had on their backs. They had as much cash as they could carry, and my grandmother had a purse full of her jewelry. And they boarded a boat. It was a cargo ship in the port of Haifa that was used to carrying cars and crates and all those sorts of things, and instead it was packed with Palestinians fleeing for their lives who had been forced out of their homes. And they spent 2 nights and the intervening day on this cargo ship on a boat bound for Beirut. My grandmother was nauseous with pregnancy hormones. She was also deeply, deeply seasick, and they had no food and no water for the entire time that they were on the ship. They finally made it to Beirut, and they spent a year in Beirut before moving on to Damascus. My mother was born in Beirut, and then they spent about a decade in Damascus before moving back to Beirut with their young family at that time. And I wish I could tell you, wouldn't it be lovely if I could tell you that as terrible as that experience was, that all happened in 1948, and now it's fine. But we know that's not the case, right? My grandparents' story is just one story of how many millions. And it's not even the worst story out there, right? We know that there are so many, and that the suffering continues, and that the violence and oppression against Palestinians didn't start with Gaza. It has been going on for more than 75 years, right? This is the world that we live in. I do promise that it doesn't stay this depressing the whole time. It does get better, a little bit, I think. So if we're gonna move on to, what number are we on? 5? Where's my 5? Oh, my 5's here. Okay, number 5. Christians in Palestine today have existed in Palestine since the time of Pentecost, live in Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Israel proper, are victims of Israeli discrimination and targeted violence, all of the above or none of the above. All of the above, right? Unfortunately, some of it is all of the above, right? Now, it's very handy that I am here on Pentecost Sunday, because like I said, I do these presentations a lot, and every time I get to this question, I always like to read a particular portion of Acts. And guess what portion that is? Maybe it'll sound familiar. This is Acts chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, and you're going to hear it if you were at the morning service. You've already heard it. If you're coming to church in a minute, you'll hear it again. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the sound of the wind, this is the Holy Spirit coming, right? At this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs? In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." Right? Now, the first thing I want to point out to you is in that long list, and I hope whoever the lector is today is prepared to read that, right? In that long list, we hear that there are Arabs. There are Arabs in this group of Jews who are the first to become Christian. There are Arabs. So Arabs have been Christian since the birthday of the church. There have always been, as long as there have been Christians, there have been Arab Christians, and we need to remember that. But I want to go back even further in that reading, because maybe you missed it. The crowds gathered, the Jews gathered there to hear the good news in their native tongue. What do they ask when they first hear this? They say, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans?" Those first disciples, those very first followers of Jesus, the ones who are speaking the good news to those gathered here, where are they from? They're from Galilee. Where is Galilee? Palestine. Galilee is in Palestine. The very first followers of Jesus were Palestinians. Jesus himself was from Galilee. Jesus himself was a Palestinian Jew. Jesus himself was a Palestinian Jew, and his first disciples, the very first followers of Jesus, the very first Christians, were Palestinian Christians. And we are their descendants. Palestinian Christians today are the descendants of these very first disciples of Christ. How dare we forget that? How dare we forget them in the terrors that they are experiencing right now? How dare we forget them in our own church here today? The Palestinian Anglicans, the Palestinian Episcopalians, the Palestinian Christians of all varieties living in diaspora here today, generation after generation. We exist, and we count, and we matter. So this is really the moment that I trace both my faith ancestry and my genetic ancestry. And I don't have many stories to tell you about Palestinian Christians today because I don't live there. I've never lived there. My family fled in 1948, and we have never been allowed back, and we will never go back, right? But there are stories of Palestinian Christians out there, and they're so easy to find on social media today. All you have to do is do a little bit of digging, and probably some of you already have. You have a Palestinian Christian here in your congregation, right? Ask her. Ask her about her story. Have you heard her story? Have you asked her to tell you her story, right? There's also another really great resource that I hope you will consider looking up and studying, maybe even studying together as a congregation. It's called the Kairos Palestine document. It was written and published in 2009, I believe, by all the patriarchs, and they're all men, so all the patriarchs of the Christian churches, Catholic, Anglican, all of them, in the Middle East, in Jerusalem. And it tells their story with a really strong, really firm, good theological foundation and understanding. And the Presbyterian Church has put together a really wonderful study guide for the Kairos Palestine document. So I really encourage you to look that up, a little Google of it, Kairos, Kairos Palestine document, will get you everything you need to know to be able to read that and learn about it and hear those stories. Okay, number 6, I believe. The current nation state of Israel is a modern day continuation of the ancient Israel, which we read about in the Old Testament. The beginnings of the fulfillment of prophecies made in the biblical book of Revelation. The Israel to which we refer in the book of Common Prayer. All of the above or none of the above? None. I was going to trick you guys. I was trying to trick you, but you didn't do it. Well done. Yeah, it's none of the above, right? There is no relationship between the Israel we read about in Scripture and modern day Israel today. There is no relationship between the Israel we read about in Scripture and the modern day state of Israel that exists today. There is no relationship. Now, you might think, this might be news to you because you might think that there is, because you might have been told that. And you have been told that. That is part of the lie of Zionism, right? That there is some sort of relationship, but there is not. Again, remember, there were Palestinian Jews living in Palestine before 1948, right? Those Jews belonged to that land, right? They were already there, but there is no relationship between ancient Israel and modern day Israel. And this idea that that Christians have, that there is some sort of divine right that Jews have to that land, is a particular kind of Zionism that is very dangerous. It is called Christian Zionism, and it is deeply dangerous and untrue. So Reverend Dr. Monto Ishak has a definition of Christian Zionism that I think is quite good. He says it's a political movement that uses the Bible to justify and legitimize Israel's position of power at the expense of Palestinians. That is Christian Zionism. And it is a profound problem in Christian thought because it completely ignores and obliterates the experience and voices of native Palestinians, and especially Palestinian Christians. And it's an inaccurate and uncontextualized and really, really poor understanding of the Scripture, right? It takes as its foundation this idea of the literal truth of Scripture, and we as Episcopalians know that that is not true. We know that that is a false interpretation and a dangerous interpretation of Scripture. And it's easy sometimes to think, well, it's those, I feel really bad about the evangelicals. I'm just like raining on them today. But it's like those evangelicals. They have Christian Zionism. We're better than that. We know that we shouldn't believe in Christian Zionism. But Christian Zionism is embedded in the Episcopal Church too, in mainline Protestant denominations. Anytime anyone thinks of Israel as having some sort of right to be there because that land belongs to Jews, is operating, maybe unintentionally, from a stance of a Christian Zionist perspective. And it's a belief that comes from a particular reading of Judeo-Christian texts and uniquely applying Judeo-Christian scripture to a secular political situation or issue, which we as Episcopalians, we never do that. We never do that, right? We hate doing that. We know that what we believe is dearly important to us and is true to us, but we would never go around saying, you have to believe this too, right? We would never do that, except when it comes to Palestine and Israel. And then we just don't realize it for what it is, right? And we have to be on our guard against it, and we have to confront it as a real problem in our doctrine and our belief. We are running out of time, so I'm going to try and go as quickly as possible through these last few. Number 7, anyone who speaks up for Palestinians and calls for a free Palestine today must be Muslim, is a terrorist and or a terrorist supporter, is anti-Semitic, and we know that Semitic means what it means, so we're going to use it now, meaning anti-Jewish, so is anti-Semitic, wants the eradication of Israel, all of the above or none of the above? None of the above. Raise your hand if you think I'm a Muslim, a terrorist, or a terrorist supporter. Well done, I'm not. I'm just like you. I happen to be a Palestinian. Now perhaps hearing me today, you think I am anti-Jewish, or you think I do want the eradication of Israel because we have been taught to believe that anyone who speaks up for Palestinians is anti-Semitic and wants the eradication of Israel. We've just been taught to believe that. So if you did think that, I wouldn't blame you, but I'm here to tell you that is not true. I'm not anti-Jewish. I do not want the eradication of Israel. I think Israel is here to stay. It's a reality. That doesn't mean that what happened to my grandparents, what happened to my ancestors is okay. Of course it's not okay. But I know that Israel is here to stay. I'm not here to try and, fight for the extermination of Israel. So I don't want the eradication of Israel. But here's what I do want. I want the ability to tell my story, my ancestors' stories, my grandparents' story, my mother's story. I want the ability to tell my story without being labeled anti-Semitic. I want a global political recognition of the real underlying issues of the conflict in the Holy Land being located in British imperialism and violent Zionism in the decades leading up to the crisis created by the Nakba of 1948. And I want a political solution to that political crisis that continues to unfold before our eyes with such particular horror and violence today, and harm against innocent Palestinians. I want a political solution to that crisis that gives Palestinians voice, dignity, and equality. I want the ability to tell my story without being labeled anti-Semitic. I want a global political recognition of the real underlying issues of the conflict in the Holy Land. And I want a political solution to the crisis that gives Palestinians voice, dignity, and equality. Number 8, the Episcopal Church was among the first churches in the West to condemn the slaughter of innocent civilians in Palestine in the weeks after October 7th and to call for a ceasefire. Like Pope Francis has called Israel's recent actions in Palestine terrorism, has taken effective steps to educate our members about our Palestinian siblings in the Holy Land, both in recent weeks and throughout the past decades. All of the above or none of the above? None. I was going to trick you again, right? No, you're wrong. You're wrong. It's not none of the above. It's all. It's none of the above. There we go. It's none of the above. It's none of the above, yeah. It's none of the above. And I want to focus on Episcopalians here because you are members, we're all members of the same church. You're people like me, right? And I want to tell, this is my own story, not my grandmother's. I want to tell my own story of heartbreak and grief. So the first time I was a deputy to General Convention, and for those of you who don't know, General Convention is the governing body of the Episcopal Church. It meets every 3 years without a pandemic, messing that up. And there are hundreds of deputies and bishops that come from all around the country and the world to come and vote on resolutions to govern and direct the direction of the Episcopal Church. And it was about 13 years ago now that I was, maybe 12 years ago, that I was first a deputy to General Convention, and there was a resolution that came to the floor of the House of Deputies, and this is what the resolution said. The resolution encouraged Episcopal churches to study the Kairos Palestine document. That document I was telling you about that's written by the patriarchs of the Holy Land, right? That was all the resolution was. Didn't demand, didn't require, it encouraged parishes of the Episcopal Church to study the Kairos Palestine document. It failed. It was not passed. You know why? Because people were concerned that if Episcopal parishes studied the Kairos Palestine document, it might offend our Jewish sibling. So we were not even willing to encourage the study of the Palestinian Christian voice. That was, this was a decade ago. And that was the first time my heart was broken by my own church, the church in which I am ordained. It was the first time, but it was not the last. Now, other Christian churches have been worse than the Episcopal Church, you'll be glad to know, right? Christian Zionism does exist in some very explicit ways in some of our Christian siblings. So there are churches that are worse. There are other Christian churches that are much better when it comes to Palestine. The UCC Church has named Israel's oppression of Palestinian people as a sin. The Presbyterians are great about the Kairos Palestine document. The Lutheran bishop, by the end of October, was already condemning Israel as well as Hamas, and even the Pope has commented about the terrorism that Israel is inflicting, right? So there are churches that are better than the Episcopal Church, but there is some slow change happening in the Episcopal Church, and I'm pleased and so proud of you all here that this church, the All Saints, is one of those places that change and transformation is happening. So well done to you. Now, we are running out of time, but is there a few questions, or is there a question to be? Goodbye, folks online. Yeah. Oh, yes. We've got a representative from Standing Together, which is a grassroots